There's a detail in this story that becomes more unsettling the longer you sit with it, and it's not the gunshots or the bodies, or even the man who was eventually dropped 6 foot 8.5 inches for it. Because a couple of weeks before any of that happened, a stranger walked up to a cottage here at Orgreave, knocked on the door and asked for something as ordinary as a glass of milk. Sarah Bakewell answered, and from everything recorded at the time, there was nothing about that moment that felt unusual enough to cause concern. Because in rural areas, people did just that, turned up at houses asking for food, work or a bit of help. And she gave him some milk after he offered to pay, but because she had no change, she said he could keep it. The man then left without any kind of disturbance. What gives that moment its weight is not what it was at the time, but what it became later. Because when this house turned into the centre of a double murder investigation, that same visit stopped being ordinary, and instead became the point where everything quietly began. On the morning of Friday the 31st of May 1895, the Bakewell household followed a routine that would have felt completely normal, with breakfast finished and the day just beginning, and nothing to suggest that within minutes everything here would be changed permanently. Inside the house were Frederick Bakewell, a man in his 60s, his wife Sarah and his son George Hackett from a previous marriage. George was visiting from his work as a railway guard and had come to spend time with his family. Not long after breakfast, Hackett stepped out through the back of the house, most likely to wash, and within moments a gunshot rang out from close range, sharp enough that it couldn't be mistaken for anything else, and sudden enough to break the quiet instantly. At around 10 to 9 that morning, a local farmer named John Reynolds was on his farmer's premises at Orgreave, roughly 100 yards from the Bakewell cottage when he heard that first report, loud enough that he immediately recognised it as a firearm, and then within seconds he had 2 or 3 more shots in rapid succession, noticeably quieter, which later gave way to the belief that the first shot had been fired outside, and the others inside the house. Hackett came back through the house already wounded and moving quickly, clearly trying to escape. And almost immediately behind him was the man responsible, following him in and continuing the attack as Hackett tried to reach the front. As Hackett reached the front of the house and made it out onto the road, another shot was fired, and within a very short space of time he collapsed there and died from the injuries he received, leaving this stretch of road as one of the most important locations in the entire case. John Reynolds ran towards the house. When he arrived, he saw Miss Bakewell leaning over her son who he knew well, and in that moment she shouted at him to go and fetch some stimulants, specifically whiskey, in the hope that something might be done. But by the time he returned, Hackett was already beyond help, dying in his mother's arms. Inside the house, Reynolds then entered the parlour and found Frederick Bakewell still in his chair. He was breathing heavily but insensible, and although he didn't actually witness the moment of death, it was clear that he'd been gravely wounded and would not recover, so Reynolds left to fetch medical help on horseback. When Dr. Wilmot arrived from Orgreave, the first thing he saw was George Hackett lying outside the front door on his back, already dead, with no coat on and the front of his shirt covered in blood, and on examination he found a small wound in the left breast. Inside the house, Frederick Bakewell had just died, with his body still warm, and the doctor identified gunshot wounds under the arm and near the spine, both inflicted at close range. The post-mortem later revealed the full extent of the injuries, showing that the bullet which struck Hackett had passed between the 5th and 6th rib, through the heart and lodged in the liver, causing almost instant death, while another bullet had lodged in the pelvis near the hip. On Frederick Bakewell, the wound showed a bullet passing across the body, damaging the heart and lung along with another wound near the spine, all consistent with shots fired from no more than 3 or 4 yards away. All of this had taken place in a matter of moments, and by the time anyone nearby fully understood what had happened, the man responsible had already left the property, moving out through the back, climbing a fence and disappearing into surrounding fields. What followed was not a lack of information, but a steady build of sightings that began to form a clear picture of movement. A shepherd named Charles Perry, who worked for Mr. Shaw of Fradley Guildhall, recalled seeing a man the night before around 8 o'clock on Sale Lane. He took note of him because he appeared uneasy or unsettled, and then again the next morning around 20 to 8, walking in the same direction towards the Coventry Canal Bridge and the road to Lichfield. Another witness, George Marler, a farmer at Parsons Brake, saw the same man moving through the fields the day before the murder. He followed him and challenged him, and at one point called out that he knew who he was. At which point the man turned, raised a firearm and fired twice in his direction, before walking on through a nearby field. Marla later identified him again while he was in custody at Burton. As these accounts were gathered, they began to form a consistent and difficult to ignore pattern, placing the same man in the same area, moving along the same routes, both before and after the murders. Within days, that man was identified as Thomas Bond. He was arrested at Hucknall and brought into custody, and from that point the focus shifted from searching the countryside to building a case against him. When he was transported to Lichfield, he was brought from Stafford Gaol on the 11 o'clock train under police escort, and even before he arrived, large crowds had gathered outside around the Guildhall, with newspapers describing the level of public interest as intense and noting that the greatest excitement prevailed. On arrival at Trent Valley Station, he was taken by cab into the city, with people lining the route in the hope of catching a glimpse. And by the time proceedings began, the Guildhall itself was crowded to the point where it was difficult to hear what was being said, with many people, noticeably women, having travelled in from surrounding districts. The magistrates presiding over the case included Mr. Madden, a Thomas Walmsley, who was the mayor of Lichfield at the time, and a Mr. George Braun. And throughout the hearing, the atmosphere remained tense and crowded. Bond himself maintained a subdued and controlled manner, speaking quietly, although witnesses noted terrible tension in him, particularly at the moment when Sarah Bakewell identified him directly as the man responsible for taking the life of her husband and a son. After the initial hearing, he was remanded and returned to Stafford, again by train, leaving shortly before 2 o'clock, with his departure watched by a number of spectators. And in a small but telling detail, when he was given a different hat to wear at the station, he refused it outright. He threw it away and stated that if he couldn't wear his own, he wouldn't wear any at all. The case then moved to Stafford Assizes, where the prosecution built its argument through the accumulation of consistent witness accounts, each placing Bond in the area and reinforcing the same sequence of events from different perspectives. The defence questioned the lack of a clear motive and challenged the reliability of identification, but the overall weight of the evidence rested in how consistently the same man had been seen, described and recognised by multiple witnesses independently. When the judge began summing up the case around 6:20, he focused not on motive, but on whether the jury believed the man in front of them was responsible, and if they did, then the law left little room for any other outcome. At 7:15, the jury retired, and after only 10 minutes, they returned with a verdict of guilty. The judge then put on his black cap and addressed Bond directly, stating that evidence against him was clear and conclusive, and that the law of the country allowed no other punishment for such a crime, before passing the sentence of death, and urging him to prepare himself for what was to come. Bond stood motionless as the sentence was delivered, remaining in the same position until an officer had to tap him on the shoulder to prompt him to move from the dock. In the weeks that followed, attention turned briefly to Sarah Bakewell, who had witnessed her husband being shot, held a son as he died, and has even been shot at herself, and yet was described as being in fair spirits despite everything she had endured, even going as far to say that she hoped the murderer would not be caught, adding that she'd completely forgiven him. Bond's background added further context, as he was around 30 years old, but had already spent years in prison for offences including horse stealing, burglary and housebreaking, and he'd only been released from a 5-year stretch around 3 weeks before the murders. Within them 3 weeks, he was already suspected of being involved in a series of burglaries across nearby areas, including Orgreave, Fradley, Kerber and Great Heywood. After the trial, he was returned to Stafford Gaol, where the final stage of the case played out, and by late August the process had run its full course, with it being reported on the 22nd of August 1895 that Thomas Bond had been executed at Stafford earlier that week, for the murders of Frederick Bakewell and George Hackett at Orgreave. In the days leading up to his execution, Bond initially refused to see any of his relatives, but after a request from his father he agreed to meet him, and during that meeting he admitted the justice of the sentence had been passed upon him. He slept a quiet final night in custody and rose around 6 o'clock in the morning of his execution, where he took a simple breakfast of chocolate and milk before being led out to the scaffolding. The executioner was a man named Scott of Huddersfield, and accounts from the time state that Bond walked firmly to the scaffold without requiring support from any wardens. He maintained the same controlled demeanour that had been noted during the trial. At a minute or two before 9 o'clock, the bolt was drawn, and death was recorded as being instantaneous. 6 foot 8.5 inch. Before his execution, Bond left a written confession with a priest, with the request that it should not be made public until after his death. And in that statement, he acknowledged that he had been lawfully accused and condemned for the willful murder of George Hackett and his stepfather. He asked for forgiveness from Miss Bakewell, Miss Hackett, and any others that had been affected by his actions, stating that he went to his death with sorrow and in the hope of divine mercy, also asking forgiveness from those he had wronged through previous crimes, and expressed particular regret towards his own family. Outside Stafford Gaol, a large crowd gathered to witness the hoisting of the black flag, the signal that the execution had been carried out, and in keeping with the practice at the time, Bond was buried within the confines of the prison. And yet even with the arrest, the trial, the sentence and the execution completed, the central question that lingered throughout the case was never fully answered, because no clear motive was ever established that could properly explain why Bond chose that house. And when you trace the story back to its beginning, it doesn't start with violence, but with that earlier moment at the door when a man asked for a glass of milk. He was seen and remembered and then walked away, because at the time it meant very little, but in the end it became the detail that tied everything together. So rest in peace, Frederick Bakewell and George Hackett.